This is Theodore reporting, and tonight we're diving headfirst into a viral conversation that has lit up social media timelines, stirred public debate, and reopened long-standing narratives surrounding one of basketball's most recognizable couples, Steph Curry and Ayesha Curry, following their recent appearance on the widely discussed podcast hosted by Michelle Obama, where a seemingly casual reflection turned into a full-blown public relations moment, raising serious questions about perception, consistency, and how public figures manage their personal narratives under intense scrutiny. Because what we are witnessing here is not just a couple sharing memories, it is a recalibration of a story that the public has been consuming for years, and the audience, as always, remembers everything. Every word, every tone, every implication, and now they are comparing, analyzing, and calling out what they see as contradictions, backtracking, and selective clarification. And it all begins with that now viral segment where Ayesha attempts to address what she describes as misconstrued statements from the past, specifically about how her relationship with Steph began, and whether her previous comments about him, his appeal, his coolness, and her own perception of him were misunderstood or simply being reframed in real time. Because according to her latest version, she didn't think he was his type. She claims she sold herself short, portraying a narrative of insecurity rather than indifference. But here's where the tension builds, because longtime viewers and followers of their story are not hearing this for the first time. They are remembering past interviews, past statements, past moments where the tone was entirely different, where Ayesha appeared confident, even dismissive at times, where she clearly stated that there was no romantic interest in Steph during their early years, repeatedly emphasizing just friends, with no hint of attraction, no suggestion that she saw him as out of her league, and certainly no admission that she thought he was cute back then. And so, when this new version emerges, it doesn't land as clarification, it lands as contradiction. And that's exactly where the public reaction begins to intensify, because audiences today are not passive. They are archivists, they are fact-checkers, they replay clips, they compare timelines, and they ask one simple question: which version is the truth? And that's where this situation becomes more than just a podcast moment. It becomes a case study in how public narratives evolve under pressure, and whether those evolutions feel authentic or strategic. And adding another layer to this unfolding situation is the presence of Michelle Obama's brother, Craig Robinson, whose reactions during the conversation did not go unnoticed, because while the tone of the interview remained light on the surface, his responses carried a subtle but unmistakable edge, moments of agreement that felt more like acknowledgement of past inconsistencies rather than blind support, moments where his expressions and interjections suggested that he, like the audience, was aware of the gap between what was being said now and what had been said before. And that dynamic added an entirely new dimension to the conversation, turning it from a simple couple's reflection into a semi-public interrogation of narrative credibility. And then there's Steph Curry himself, sitting beside his wife, listening, reacting, occasionally laughing. And that laughter, particularly that deep leaned-back reaction that caught so much attention, has been interpreted in multiple ways, some seeing it as genuine amusement, others viewing it as a subtle acknowledgement of the situation, perhaps even a signal that conversations like this have already taken place behind closed doors. Because when a public figure's personal life becomes a recurring topic of debate, it is almost inevitable that private discussions follow. Discussions about image, about messaging, about how certain comments are received, and whether they align with the values and persona that the individual wants to project. And this is where the broader conversation begins to shift, because this isn't just about one interview or one comment. It's about a pattern that critics argue has been present for years, a pattern where Ayesha's public remarks about her marriage have occasionally sparked controversy, whether it was her comments about not receiving attention from other men during an appearance involving Jada Pinkett Smith, or earlier statements about not wanting marriage or children, which, while entirely valid as personal feelings at a certain point in life, have been revisited and reinterpreted in light of her current role as a wife and mother of 4. And that's where the public perception becomes complicated, because people are not just evaluating what is being said, they are evaluating how it fits into the larger narrative of the relationship and whether there is consistency, growth, or contradiction. And it's important to note that growth itself is not the issue. People evolve, perspectives change, priorities shift, especially when relationships begin at a young age, as was the case here, with Steph and Ayesha meeting as teenagers, navigating friendship, romance, and eventually building a family together. But the challenge arises when that evolution is presented in a way that seems to overwrite or reinterpret the past without fully acknowledging it, because audiences can accept change, but they are less forgiving of what appears to be revision, and that's exactly the line this situation is walking. And then there's the commentary that has resurfaced from figures like Kevin Samuels, whose past critiques of the relationship have been brought back into the conversation, adding fuel to an already heated debate, with some viewers using those past opinions to reinforce their current interpretations, while others push back, arguing that external commentary should not define or dictate how a couple's dynamic is understood. And this back and forth highlights a key reality of modern celebrity culture, where personal relationships are no longer just personal. They are public narratives, subject to analysis, critique, and constant reinterpretation. And in this environment, every statement matters, every tone shift is noticed, every inconsistency is amplified. And that brings us to the central question driving this entire discussion. Is this a genuine moment of reflection and growth, or is it a calculated effort to reshape a narrative that at times has worked against them in the court of public opinion? Because from one perspective, this could be seen as a positive shift, a willingness to acknowledge past mistakes, to adjust how certain topics are discussed, to present a more unified and supportive image as a couple, and there is nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, it could be argued that such adjustments are necessary in a world where public perception can have real consequences. But from another perspective, the timing, the framing, and the contrast with past statements make it difficult for some to fully accept this as purely organic. And that skepticism is what keeps the conversation alive, what drives the commentary, what turns a single podcast segment into a viral moment that continues to circulate, dissected and debated across platforms. And yet, through all of this, one thing remains clear. Steph Curry has consistently maintained a public image of respect, support, and admiration for his wife, rarely engaging in controversy, rarely deviating from that narrative. And that consistency is part of what makes these moments stand out even more, because they contrast so sharply with his established persona. And that contrast shapes how the public interprets not just Ayesha's comments, but the dynamic between them as a whole. And ultimately, what we are witnessing here is not just a conversation about a relationship. It is a reflection of how modern audiences engage with public figures, how they track narratives over time, how they respond to perceived inconsistencies, and how they demand a level of authenticity that leaves very little room for error. Because in today's media landscape, the past is always accessible, always replayable, always part of the present conversation. And so when a new version of a story emerges, it doesn't replace the old one. It exists alongside it, creating a layered narrative that the audience must navigate, interpret, and ultimately judge for themselves. And that is exactly what is happening here, as viewers weigh the latest statements against years of prior commentary, forming their own conclusions about what is genuine, what is strategic, and what it all means for the public image of one of the most talked about couples in sports and entertainment today.